word sin carries weight. It shows up in laws, sermons, movies, even casual conversations. Most people hear it and think of morality, right and wrong, maybe guilt, but very few ask where the idea actually came from, what it meant before it was turned into doctrine, what it was before it became a tool, because that's what sin eventually became, a tool, not just for teaching values, but for controlling behavior, for shaping entire societies, for creating systems where the authority to define wrongness belonged to those in power. But it didn't start that way. The earliest human societies didn't have a concept of sin in the way we know it today. They had customs, taboos, social codes, things that held communities together. If you violated those, there might be consequences, but those consequences were social, not cosmic. The idea that your actions could offend a divine being, that you could be born already guilty, that normal human impulses could carry eternal consequences, that was a much later invention. And like many inventions, it served a purpose. Sin gave religious leaders the ability to define not just actions but thoughts as wrong, not just harm but desire, not just behavior but identity. It allowed morality to move from something shared to something imposed. And once that happened, the rules stopped reflecting human need and started reflecting institutional power. This shift wasn't subtle. Take the concept of original sin, the idea that all people are born guilty because of something someone else supposedly did at the beginning of time, that we start our lives already needing redemption. It's one of the most foundational doctrines in many major religions. But look closer, and it's clearly built on a story, a metaphor, a myth. One that asks us to believe that two people in a garden ate forbidden fruit, and now everyone else deserves punishment. That's not ethics, that's mythology. But the consequences of that mythology are real. When people are told from birth that they're broken, that they need saving, that they're nothing without divine forgiveness, it creates a mindset, one shaped by shame, fear, and dependency. It doesn't just teach people how to behave, it teaches them how to see themselves, not as full human beings capable of growth and error, but as flawed, fallen creatures constantly at risk of damnation. That framing has shaped entire legal systems, school curricula, cultural taboos. It's given cover to discrimination, violence, even war, all under the justification that some actions or thoughts are sinful, even when they cause no harm. But the word itself makes it hard to question, because once something is labeled a sin, it becomes untouchable, beyond discussion. It doesn't matter why you did it, or who it affected, or what the context was. If it's sin, it's wrong, period. And that's where the concept stops being moral and starts being ideological. It replaces ethics with rules, it reduces complex human behavior to binary categories, and it punishes deviation not because it causes harm, but because it challenges authority. This is where sin becomes more than just an idea. It becomes infrastructure. It's built into the rituals, the language, the worldview. It defines purity, punishment, worth. It tells people which thoughts to confess, which feelings to fear, which parts of themselves to reject. And when those beliefs are handed down as sacred, they're rarely questioned, even when they lead to suffering. Think of how many people have lived in fear because their sexual orientation was labeled as sin. How many were told their bodies were shameful? How many were taught that curiosity, anger, desire, things all humans feel, made them guilty by default? That's not morality, that's control disguised as virtue. And once you see that the entire framework begins to shift, you start to realize that sin as a category isn't fixed. It changes from one time and place to another. What was sinful 100 years ago is normal today. What's forbidden in one religion is sacred in another. So who decides? And why? Those questions don't get asked often, because sin isn't designed to invite questions. It's designed to create certainty. and certainty is comfortable, even when it's wrong. But when you start to question the idea of sin itself, you don't end up with moral chaos. You end up with something better. You end up with ethics, because ethics, unlike sin, is based on consequences, on empathy, on evidence. It asks, does this action help or harm? Does it respect others? Does it contribute to human flourishing? Those are hard questions, but they're honest ones, and they lead to a kind of moral clarity that sin never could, because they don't rely on invisible threats or supernatural rules. They rely on reason, on shared values, on the kind of wisdom that can evolve. That's something sin can't do. Sin freezes morality in place. It ties it to ancient texts and unquestionable doctrines. It assumes that the rules were handed down perfectly and that our job is just to obey. But real morality asks more of us. It asks us to think, to care, to adapt, to take responsibility for our actions, not because of fear, but because of understanding. That's not the world sin wants. Because in the world of sin, obedience is more important than understanding. Conformity is more important than compassion. Fear is more important than growth. And that's why people are starting to let go of it. Not because they want to do whatever they want, but because they want to live in a way that makes sense, that respects others, that doesn't require guilt as a constant companion. They want a morality that sees them as capable, not corrupted. And more importantly, they want a life where worth isn't something to be earned or lost. A life where they don't have to be afraid of being human. The fear of being human, that's really at the heart of it. Because sin doesn't just define actions, it defines people. It says that you're not just someone who made a mistake, you are a mistake, flawed by default, corrupted at the root. And when you start life with that belief, everything else gets filtered through it, even joy. You can't just feel good without wondering if it's temptation. You can't relax without questioning if it's laziness. You can't be confident without worrying if it's pride. Every normal, healthy emotion gets passed through a moral lens that turns it into something dangerous. That's how control works. It doesn't just punish the forbidden, it makes you fear the natural. And when that fear becomes internalized, it no longer needs to be enforced. People police themselves. They confess feelings that never hurt anyone. They apologize for thoughts they never acted on. They live with a sense of guilt that was planted before they ever had a chance to understand the world. And often, the people closest to them reinforce it. And it's not because they're cruel, but because they believe it too. Parents teach it to children. Teachers repeat it in classrooms. Leaders preach it from stages. And because the message comes wrapped in love, I'm telling you this because I care about your soul. It becomes almost impossible to reject. Because rejecting the message feels like rejecting the people you love. So people learn to carry it quietly. And in many cases, they don't even see it as trauma, they see it as truth. They don't recognize that the guilt they feel isn't coming from their actions. It's coming from the framework that defined those actions as wrong in the first place. And once you start pulling on that thread, the entire structure begins to unravel. Because what happens when you take sin out of the equation? What are you left with? You're left with responsibility. Not to a God, not to a doctrine, but to reality, to each other, to yourself. That's a heavier burden in some ways, but it's also more honest. Because you can't hide behind rules. You can't say, it's a sin and end the conversation. You have to ask what actually happens when people do this. Who benefits? Who's harmed? What are the unintended consequences? It's slower, it's messier, but it's real. And it doesn't rely on shame to function. That's a hard shift to make for people raised with sin as the baseline, because when guilt has been your compass, it's disorienting to move without it. You start to question your own instincts. You wonder if letting go of sin will lead you into chaos. What it doesn't. It leads you into agency. You begin to see that morality isn't about punishment. It's about connection, about how your choices ripple out into the lives around you, about building something sustainable, not avoiding something terrifying. And slowly the fear starts to fade. You realize that desire isn't dangerous, that curiosity isn't rebellion, that questioning isn't betrayal, and that you can live a good life, a meaningful, compassionate, thoughtful life, without seeing yourself as inherently flawed. That realization is life-changing, because once you remove the framework of sin, you're free to build something better. Not perfect, but honest. You can make space for doubt, for disagreement, for growth. You can admit when you're wrong, not because you've offended a divine rule, but because you see the impact of your actions. And that's the kind of morality people actually trust. Not one that says obey or suffer, but one that says understand and choose. That's not weakness, that's strength. Because it takes far more courage to think critically than it does to follow orders. It takes more self-awareness to question your beliefs than to defend them. And it takes more integrity to admit you were wrong than to claim eternal certainty. But sin doesn't reward that kind of thinking. It rewards obedience. And that's why it's lasted as long as it has. Because systems that define sin also define who gets to forgive it. Who gets to decide what's wrong? Who gets to speak with authority? And when that authority is treated as divine, it becomes very hard to challenge. But people are challenging it, not out of rebellion, but out of reason. Because they're realizing that much of what they were taught to fear was never wrong in the first place. It was just human, and being human shouldn't be a sin. When being human is seen as a moral failure, the damage runs deep. It doesn't just affect how people think, it affects how they relate to others, how they trust, how they set boundaries, how they see bodies, emotions, and relationships. Because sin doesn't just stay in the abstract. It filters down into rules about clothing, gender roles, intimacy, identity. It tells people not just what they can do, but who they're allowed to be. And often, the result isn't virtue, it's repression. People don't become more ethical when they're told they're sinful. They become more afraid, more secretive, more likely to hide their real selves just to survive in a system that punishes honesty. That's not moral development, that's damage. And yet the system continues, because it benefits from silence. As long as people blame themselves, they don't question the rules. As long as they feel guilty, they look for redemption, not reform. And as long as they see sin as truth, they don't ask who invented it in the first place. But when you start asking that question, things get clearer, because sin, as a category, didn't fall from the sky. It was shaped by people, by institutions, by needs that had more to do with control than care. Look at how the concept of sin expanded over time. What started as prohibitions against real harm, theft, violence, betrayal, quickly grew to include things like envy, lust, pride, emotions, thoughts. Desires that, on their own, don't hurt anyone, but were labeled as dangerous. Why? Because they couldn't be controlled from the outside. And when a system can't control behavior through force, it learns to control it through fear. By convincing people that their own minds are the enemy, that their natural impulses are traps, that joy is suspicious, that pleasure needs permission, that love is only valid if it fits the script. That kind of control doesn't need constant enforcement. Once the fear is internalized, people carry it with them. They monitor their own thoughts. They confess things that never hurt anyone. They apologize for being alive in the wrong way. And that self-monitoring is exhausting. It leads to burnout, anxiety, depression, even trauma. And what makes it worse is that it's rarely recognized as harm. It's framed as spiritual discipline, as growth, as necessary suffering. But necessary for what? Not for becoming a better person, for becoming a more compliant one. Because when morality is defined as submission, the people who benefit most are always the ones in charge. And that's why questioning the idea of sin is so powerful, because it shifts the focus away from rules and back toward people, away from dogma and back toward impact. It asks, what actually makes life better? What actually reduces harm? What actually strengthens trust, compassion, accountability? Those are hard questions, but they're the right ones, because they don't rely on punishment. They rely on presence. They require you to pay attention not just to the rules, but to the real effects of your choices. And they open up space for growth. Because in a system built around sin, there's very little room to change. You're either guilty or forgiven. You're in or you're out. You're saved or you're damned. But in the real world, people are more complicated than that. We all make mistakes. We all have regrets. But that doesn't mean we're fundamentally broken. It means we're learning, and that process of learning, adapting, making amends works best when it's not wrapped in fear. Fear doesn't create empathy, it creates compliance. And empathy is what ethics actually needs. Empathy doesn't need sin, it doesn't need threats, it doesn't need metaphysical judgment, it needs understanding. It needs listening. It needs the willingness to admit when something isn't working and the courage to try something better. And that's what more people are doing. Quietly, gradually, sometimes without even realizing it, they're stepping away from the language of sin. They're replacing it with something more human, not perfect, but honest. Honesty is what sin was never built to handle, because honesty makes space for questions, for change, for growth that doesn't follow a script. But sin needs certainty. It needs rules that can't be challenged. It needs people to believe that the system itself is sacred. So when someone starts asking honest questions, not rebellious ones, just sincere, the system treats them like a threat. Questions like, why is this wrong if it doesn't hurt anyone? Why is this punished but not that? Why do the rules apply differently depending on who you are? These aren't dangerous questions. They're necessary ones. But when the idea of sin has been taught as untouchable truth, even asking becomes a kind of taboo. And that taboo protects more than just belief. It protects power. Because sin often mirrors the needs of the people who define it. The things labeled sinful tend to be the things that disrupt the status quo, that challenge authority, that give people too much agency. Look at how often sin is applied selectively. A poor person stealing food is a sinner, but a wealthy person exploiting labor is a leader. A teenager exploring their identity is a threat to tradition, but a preacher abusing power is a test of faith. That's not morality, that's convenience. And over time, people start to notice. They may not have the words for it, they may not speak out loud, but inside something starts to shift. The fear that once kept them quiet turns into a kind of dissonance, a sense that the rules don't add up, that the guilt they carry doesn't match the harm they've done. And that feeling, uncomfortable as it is often the first step toward clarity. Clarity that says, maybe this isn't about what's right or wrong, maybe it's about what's useful to the people in charge. That doesn't mean ethics doesn't matter. It means the current version might not be ethical at all. It means starting from scratch, not to reject morality, but to rebuild it on purpose. To ask, what kind of values do we actually want? What kind of world are we trying to create? And how do we hold each other accountable in ways that are honest, fair, and grounded in reality? That's a much harder project. It takes more time, more nuance, more courage, but it leads somewhere better because it allows people to grow not out of fear of being wrong, but out of hope for doing better. It doesn't say you're worthless unless forgiven. It says you have worth already, and with that comes responsibility. It doesn't treat mistakes as moral failures, it treats them as part of being alive, and it doesn't need a concept like sin to function. That doesn't mean everything becomes relative, it means everything becomes relational. You still ask what's right and wrong, you still draw lines, you still care about justice. But you do it with awareness, with the understanding that moral clarity doesn't come from ancient lists of forbidden acts. It comes from paying attention to people, to outcomes, to consequences you can actually see. That's the kind of morality that doesn't need to scare you into submission, because it doesn't need to pretend that being human is a problem to solve. It sees humanity, with all its complexity, its flaws, its contradictions, as the starting point, not the enemy. And in that view, there's no such thing as original sin. There's only original context, original need, original attempts to make sense of the world. And we can honor that without being bound by it, because the goal isn't to go back, it's to move forward, to create frameworks that reflect what we've learned, not just what we've inherited. And what we've learned is this: fear works, but only for a while. It keeps people in line. It enforces rules. It creates the illusion of order, but it also creates resentment. It distorts growth. It blocks real understanding, and eventually people start to see through it. That's what's happening now. People are starting to notice that fear-based morality doesn't actually lead to better lives. It leads to secrecy, double standards, emotional repression. It leads to communities that punish honesty more than harm. And it starts early. When children are told that they are sinners, before they've even made a decision of their own, the damage begins before they can name it. That's not education, that's indoctrination. It doesn't teach responsibility, it teaches shame. It teaches that worth is something fragile, that you're only lovable if you follow the rules, that your own voice can't be trusted. And when that teaching comes from every direction, from family, from teachers, from scripture, it takes years to undo. Even when the belief fades, the imprint can stay. Someone may stop believing in sin, but still feel guilty for saying no, for setting a boundary, for enjoying their own life without apology. That's the long shadow of sin. It lingers in the body, in the nervous system, in the quiet self-judgment that doesn't need anyone else to say it out loud. And that's what makes it so powerful as a tool of control. Because once guilt is internalized, it keeps people small. Not through punishment, but through self-correction. Through that subtle, constant whisper that says, "You're not enough." But if sin is an invention, if it was created, not discovered, then that guilt can be questioned. It doesn't have to be the default. It doesn't have to shape your entire identity. You can recognize that morality isn't about avoiding sin, it's about choosing values. And values aren't handed down. They are built through reflection, through connection, through real engagement with what matters. That kind of ethics doesn't rely on a list of prohibitions. It asks better questions. What helps people thrive? What protects dignity? What builds trust? Those are questions sin was never designed to answer, because sin doesn't ask about impact, it asks about obedience. And that's why it fails at creating a truly moral society. A society built around sin might look orderly on the surface, but underneath it's shaped by fear, by suppression, by quiet suffering that no one's allowed to talk about. A healthy society doesn't need people to feel worthless in order to behave. It doesn't need people to fear eternal punishment just to be kind. It needs people who are connected, who see each other's humanity, who understand that their actions matter, not because of what's written in a book, but because of how those actions affect the world around them. That's a deeper kind of morality. And it starts with letting go of frameworks that treat people like problems. Because the idea of sin doesn't just mislabel behavior, It mislabels people. It says, you are wrong by default. You were born in deficit. You owe something just for existing. And that belief undermines everything else. It makes it harder to heal, harder to forgive, harder to grow, because if your core identity is broken, then no amount of progress ever feels like enough. But you're not broken by default. You're not a flaw that needs fixing. You're a person capable of good and harm, of joy and failure, of change. And you don't need to see yourself as sinful to be responsible. In fact, the opposite is often true. People become more responsible when they stop being afraid of themselves. When people stop being afraid of themselves, they start to live differently. They stop filtering every decision through fear of punishment. They stop defining their worth by whether they fit someone else's standard. They stop apologizing for being human. And they begin to rebuild from the ground up. Not just a new set of rules, but a new relationship with morality. One that isn't based on shame, but on awareness. One that doesn't use guilt as a motivator, but invites people to think critically. One that doesn't turn obedience into virtue, but turns understanding into action. That's the kind of morality that lasts. Because it doesn't depend on fear, it depends on reflection, on context, on care. And it doesn't collapse when belief does. It stays. It evolves. It adapts to what we learn about ourselves, about others, about what kind of world we want to live in. A world where kindness isn't transactional. Where compassion doesn't need eternal reward to be meaningful. Where being good isn't a way to avoid punishment, but a way to live better, together. That kind of world doesn't need sin. It needs responsibility, yes, it needs accountability, but it doesn't need invisible guilt systems that tell people they're wrong by default. It needs frameworks that treat people as capable of learning, capable of changing, capable of choosing good because they understand why it matters, not because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. And that kind of choice is more powerful than any command because it means someone is acting from awareness, not compliance. And that's where real ethics begins. Not with obedience, but with understanding. Not with fear, but with care. Not with sin, but with choice. Because the idea of sin, at its core, was never about morality, it was about control. And once you see that, really see it, it becomes clear how much damage that idea has done. To individuals, to relationships, to entire communities that believed guilt was a path to goodness. But goodness doesn't grow from guilt. It grows from empathy, from honesty, from the freedom to be wrong without believing you're worthless. It grows when people are no longer afraid to ask hard questions, when they're no longer punished for being curious, when they no longer carry the weight of invented guilt. That's what's happening now, slowly, quietly, person by person. People are letting go of the language of sin. They're replacing it with clarity, with conscience, with a kind of ethics that doesn't require supernatural threats to be meaningful. And they're discovering something surprising. Life without sin isn't emptier. It's lighter, more grounded, more honest. Because in that life, being human isn't a failure, it's a starting point. A place where morality begins, not because it was imposed from above, but because it was chosen together from below. Not a list of sins to avoid, but a set of values to live by.